Totalitarian tyranny does not rest on strength, but on fear. This is a quote by Albert Camus, the French philosopher who was also the second youngest person in history to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. Indeed, the French did do a lot to inform the world about democracy and revolution. One guy, however, seems to have missed the memo. That is who we'll be discussing today. Chef Skinner was the main antagonist of Disney's 2007 film Ratatouille, and he was a tyrannical villain. The reason this particular character was so evil is that he didn't outright kill anyone, but he was wholly opposed to the idea of dreams. And what makes him so terrifying is that he was a little too realistic. A lot of us will have, at some point, worked with a boss who swatted ideas away, verbally lashed their employees, and was only concerned with making money. That's a pretty accurate summary of Skinner's personality, and it's the reason he's so important to dissect. Understanding the motives of people like these helps equip us to see them for what they really are, a bully, and to stand up to them when we meet them in daily life. But that wasn't all there was to this guy. Chef Skinner wasn't just tyrannical because he was a bully, it was because the way that he was written wove his motives and backstory in perfectly with his despotism.
How dare you cook in my kitchen?
Indeed, everything about Chef Skinner, from his slick and sharp mustache to his tiny figure, is the personification of a selfish despot. But to understand how he was minting money off a well-established brand while blatantly disregarding its core mission, let's take a look at where the story takes place. It wouldn't be inaccurate to say that Ratatouille takes place in Paris, but the truth is that it takes place in a gourmet kitchen. I think that the setting of this film ties brilliantly in with the villainy of Skinner. This is because a kitchen, particularly that of a Michelin star restaurant, is supposed to be fast-paced and a little brutal. But this particular one was formerly owned by the brilliant chef Gusteau. As we are told throughout the film, Gusteau famously believed that anyone could cook. This was meant to point out that no matter where someone came from, if they had a natural knack for flavors, they could be excellent at it. The statement was essentially democratic. It welcomed everyone to try their hand at chopping up vegetables and giving the pot a stir. Chef Skinner, by contrast, believed in thick stacks of cash. He didn't really care about the food. No, Skinner's concern throughout the film was to maintain his status as the head chef of a famous restaurant. As we saw, this was why he literally ridiculed Linguini when the man showed up at the restaurant looking for a job. But ridiculing Linguini and handing him a mop wasn't all that Skinner did. He didn't just shout at and berate him either. No, Chef Skinner hid away a letter from Linguini's mother that threatened to loosen his grip on the restaurant. That's what made him such a tyrannical villain. In contrast to the entire theme of the film, which revolved around refinement of palate and a discerning love for the sounds, smells, and textures of various types of food, Chef Skinner was detached from it all. This was astonishing considering that he was the head chef at one of the most prominent restaurants in Paris, and the city itself is known for food, besides love. And it was also obscenely obvious. Not only did we never see Chef Skinner cook a single meal throughout the film, he also went decidedly against his French roots and favored Americanized versions of European foods like burritos and hot dogs. I mean, why? And if Skinner was really so aloof from the pleasures of French cooking, why was he so desperately clinging onto his seat as the head chef at the late Gusteau's restaurant? Who even made this guy head chef? And what were they thinking? We find some hints in his backstory. This is where we understand why this lunacy took place. Before we do that though, I have a question. Do you think that Remy should have worked with Colette rather than Linguini? I mean, she and the rat clearly share more interests, but I think that she'd have flung him out of the restaurant before Remy ever got a chance to speak, or more specifically, nod. Let me know what you think in the comments below. While Skinner's complete origins aren't visually elucidated in the film, we gather from context that once upon a time, he and Gusteau worked together. It's theorized that Skinner was the sous chef in Gusteau's kitchen, but after the tragic passing of the head chef, because of a food critic's scathing review, Skinner took over his place. Some canon also suggests that Skinner may have been behind the death of Gusteau in the first place, since it didn't make sense that someone who loved food as much as Gusteau would make and serve a meal that wasn't at all excellent. Of course, being an experimental person, Gusteau could occasionally have put together some failed, or perhaps incomplete, creations. But that didn't warrant such an awful review. I will cede that this canon has some merit, and that's because of something that we saw in the film. About 47 minutes into the film, a convention arrives at the restaurant and demands something fresh. They want to try a Gusteau recipe that they haven't tried before. At this point, any concerned chef would want to serve a revamped version of a beloved classic. That's not what Skinner did.
A forgotten favorite of the chef's, sweetbread à la Gusteau.
And when a cook reminds that Gusteau himself thought that recipe was a disaster, Skinner brushes the comment off. At this point, we were all thinking the same thing. It would have destroyed the restaurant's reputation if the customers had been served such a total monstrosity. I mean, seaweed salted crust with cuttlefish tentacles and dog roast puree, duck eggs, and fungus? What was even going on there? Gross. But the fact that Skinner was ready to have this served to the clients simply to throw Linguini under the bus went to show that he didn't care about the restaurant. He wasn't interested in food. He didn't care about the place's reputation. Skinner only cared about dough. And I'm not talking about what you use to make bread. I'm talking about cold, hard cash. And why did this tiny little man want to discredit Linguini's cooking? I mean, the guy was a silly old garbage boy. What threat could he possibly pose? That was the secret of the purple letter. At the start, when the plotline was still unfolding, we further gathered a little about Skinner's origins. Evidently, Gusteau had been quite close with a woman named Renata, and without his knowledge, he had fathered an heir with her. When Skinner learned about this fact, we watched him get visibly disconcerted. And that is why Skinner was afraid of Linguini. In my opinion, it's rather comical that someone as bullish and imposing, despite the height, as Skinner should be scared of someone as vapid and wacky as Linguini. But there you have it. It happened. And it helped put Linguini's personality and motives into further perspective. Here, there's a writing tip that we all should take note of. When writing a tyrannical villain, it's best to pose a threat to their tyranny. This threat is best positioned at something that would cause them to lose their power. This strengthens and reestablishes their role as a tyrannical villain, and you get to play around with the actions that they would take to do so. What further strengthens Skinner's villainy is his complete lack of concern with the evident interests of what he was ruling over, the most eminent restaurant in Paris. It also went against the message of the film. Skinner had a legacy to preserve, and it was definitely not that of Gusteau's. But if his objective wasn't to retain or improve the ratings of the restaurant, then what was he really doing? Because Skinner captured Remy and forced him to a line of frozen foods, we immediately understood that Skinner wanted to batch produce items that would cost him little to make and bring him hordes of cash in return. But beyond this obvious agenda, what was really going on in this tiny man's head? What caused him to want to do this? To understand this, I'll explain Skinner's motives. When Chef Skinner lost his position as the head chef of the late Gusteau's restaurant, what he did was strange. We didn't watch him go back to his kitchen at home and hatch a diabolical plot to make the most exquisite recipe that France had ever seen. We didn't see him apply to other restaurants and try his hand at cooking there. I mean, even if he didn't like cooking, the man had been Gusteau's pal for decades. He would surely have picked up a thing or two. He did none of that. Rather, we watched Chef Skinner don measly disguises and hide behind newspapers as he continued to spy on Gusteau's kitchen. To begin with, dude, get a life. But what all this really showed us was what Skinner's true motive had been all along. Can you guess what it is? I'll hang on for a second. Drop a comment below, please. All done? Okay. See, what Skinner really wanted, beyond all that bullying and bashing and ruthless demeanor, was for himself to remain relevant. It might not be the most obvious motive, but it makes sense when you examine the mindset of a tyrant. All authoritarian regimes always call dibs on the best resources and the cream of the crop. But once all that is done and dusted, they continue to hold their position, and it all stems from a desire to stay in the picture, to be around when the shots are called. Many political philosophers such as Antonio Gramsci, Hans Morgenthau, and Emanuel Wallerstein reported that all hegemonic and essentially totalitarian governments used various means and mechanisms to control and influence their subjects. Staying relevant was always essential to doing so. After all, you can't exercise power over that which you're not an active part of. That was really the reason that Skinner was such a bully, because he hid around in his office always, devising new money-making schemes. He wanted to keep reminding the employees that he was the boss around there, and he established that through cold brutality. But when he lost his power, because Remy made sure everyone found out that Linguini was Gusteau's son and heir, Skinner simply couldn't shake all this off. He wanted to return to his former position, and that is why he kept spying on the staff. I mean, seriously, the dude could have just rolled his sleeves up and started cooking at another restaurant. He could have gone on a little vacation. There was so much that Skinner could have been doing. Instead, he chose to spy. And then he called up a health inspector and reported a rat infestation. The reason that Skinner was so obsessed with Remy was actually Disney's nod to the scientist, B.F. Skinner. This guy was famous for his experiments with rats, particularly what he discovered with rats about behavioral conditioning through punishment and reward. Also, Chef Skinner didn't seem to reward anyone. All he did was yell and subdue. But he did once give Linguini a whole lot of wine in an effort to confirm his suspicions about Remy. And all of it boiled down to one thing. He wanted to remain in power. Chef Skinner wasn't going to allow a noodle-headed garbage boy to take over his restaurant. In my opinion, the reason that Chef Skinner bullied and berated everyone in the kitchen was because he was insecure about his position there. For one, he was only a partner to Gusteau, and more importantly, Skinner never liked to cook. Because this fact clashed monumentally with his core position, I think that he might have felt a little bit like an imposter. So he abused everyone in order to show them who was the boss. While a lot of people believe that a gourmet kitchen is a high-stress environment and that yelling and shouting would make sense there, I beg to disagree. This is because we have the example of Chef Gusteau, a kitchen maestro who was jolly to the bone. I think that Skinner always knew that he was misplaced as the head chef all along, but he wasn't prepared to let go of such an esteemed position of power. And when it was taken away from him, he turned vengeful. During the time that Skinner exercised his reign of terror, though, he had everyone under his thumb, even this guy.
Kill the man with this thumb.
The manner in which he intimidated and controlled everyone was made clear from the fact that Gusteau's love of experimental cooking was lost. The people there were merely cogs in a machine, following preset instructions and repeating what the late chef had already done. But Skinner's chilling and intimidating demeanor looms large from the very first time that we spot him. Let's take a look at the entrance scene. Chef Skinner made his first appearance in the film with his nose buried into a stack of papers. While the staff greet him as they cook, he does not deign to spare them a glance. I thought that this was meant to show us that he was detached and self-absorbed, rather than running a restaurant based on the ideals of flavorful cooking. He had converted Gusteau's enterprise into just another workplace. This was in stark contrast to everything that we had learned about Gusteau up until this point in the movie, and the film took about 18 minutes establishing that. So we were all pretty invested in the utopian ideas of cooking as a dream. The reason this was so perfectly executed was that Disney frequently demonstrates through its films how tyranny will yield a demise. We saw that in The Lion King, where Scar's rule has left the kingdom barren. This is exactly what was happening here. Responding to warmth and respect with silence is a classic intimidation tactic, and the fact that the workers in the kitchen are still eager to stay in Skinner's good graces implies that they are terrified of him. but he exercises his power with measure. I'll explain what I mean by this in just a minute. Here in the entrance scene, there are a few key things to note. Upon learning that the staff has already hired Linguini, Skinner is infuriated. Of course, he thinks that they should have consulted him. But the fact that they didn't indicates not only that the staff already knows that Skinner isn't very involved with the restaurant, but also that they are a unit.
Oh, garbage, well.
Skinner didn't even know that the place was short-staffed, and I'm pretty sure that the sous chef, as well as the combined efforts of the entire team and their love for Gusteau, was all that was holding the restaurant together. But what Skinner lacked in concern, he made up for in tactfulness. That's what he applied when he began to suspect that the rat he kept seeing with Linguini was somehow linked to a week of incredible cooking. Rather than bullying the secret out of the boy, he offered him a drink. And truthfully, in vino veritas, except that Linguini was too underwhelmed by what was going on in his life to say so. I mean, come on, if I had been learning recipes from a rat, I would be so excited about it that I would blurt it out at every given opportunity. But the fact that Skinner didn't have the luck of finding this out is what made his demise so terribly funny. Before we dive into that though, let's explore his actions. The things that Skinner did give us plenty of information about how to write the perfect tyrannical villain. To begin with, he was detached, self-absorbed, and imposing. He clung desperately onto a position that he should have yielded to someone else a long time ago. This gives us context in how to play motive into actions while writing a tyrannical villain. I'll explore this bit by bit. For this, I'm going to backtrack a bit so that I can establish each of his actions properly. In the beginning, Skinner dismissed the values of his old friend. This went to show that his relationship with Gusteau was founded on his desire for power. Skinner appears to have cultivated an alliance with Gusteau in order to profit off the chef's celebrity, which, I might add, he continued to do long after the chef passed away. Whether or not Skinner staged a coup for Gusteau was not elucidated in the film. We did see Skinner get comfortable though. Considering the fact that he didn't care for food, staying at the position of a head chef at a Michelin star restaurant decade after decade didn't make sense. But when we saw the home that they gave to Linguini, we quickly understood that Skinner was in it for the luxury that the position afforded him. Skinner's psyche was also completely antithetical to Gusteau's ideas about running a restaurant. This is made evident from the fact that he is absolutely baffled when Linguini's soup made a food critic happy. I'll admit that even I wouldn't have believed that Linguini could make anything worthy of swallowing. But Skinner was disdainful towards the boy well before the soup incident occurred.
But of course, Gusteau wouldn't hesitate.
Even here, Skinner seemed to be irritated with Linguini's presence, even though there was no reason to be. Maybe he's just a grumpy guy in general. But making Skinner irritable without any obvious reason allowed us to understand that he was a little shaky on the inside, which is a classic quality of any good villain. And that's something that we can translate to a tyrannical villain that we write for ourselves. But remember what I said about Skinner being tactical? That's also evident from the fact that he gives Linguini a chance. When Nicole reminds the kitchen about Gusteau's motto, anyone can cook, Skinner acts in a calculated manner. He's not going to antagonize the staff, so he makes an elaborate display of how he agrees to let the garbage boy cook. He also cleverly tries to set a landmine in place. By asking Nicole to train the boy, he tries to divide and conquer. Skinner's not wrong about the fact that Linguini isn't the sharpest knife in the bunch, and it's fair to assume that Nicole would soon give up on him. But the artfulness with which he does all of this is what makes him a tyrannical villain. And here's another lesson for all of us. Tyrannical villains typically manage to stay in power because of their shrewdness and razor-sharp minds. We've observed this in examples of tyrannical villains like Scar before. This method is tried and tested. Next, Skinner asks Linguini to recreate the same soup as before. The reason he gives Linguini so much time is that if he didn't give the boy a fair chance, he would risk antagonizing the whole kitchen. Maintaining his dominion over them is only possible if none of them decides to rebel. And I mean, given the fact that he's not getting his apron messy, he kind of needs all of them there. When his plan backfires and people come in asking for something like the soup that Linguini previously made, Skinner responds by trying to undermine him. This too is a stealth attack, but at this point, he's getting impatient. See, the reason Skinner hated Linguini so much is that the Garbage Boy's accidental soup creation threatened to change things. Skinner was running a ship the way that he wanted. No new ideas, only profits. When the boy came in and did something new, Skinner began to suspect that this might cause everyone in the kitchen to come up with their own ideas. If that happened, he could no longer control them. I think that threatening Skinner with someone like Linguini was absolutely hilarious. The reason it works so well is that Linguini's silliness accentuates the cunningness of Skinner's evil when it is observed in contrast. At this point, the reason Skinner is so desperate to get rid of Linguini is also because of the letter from Renata, the one that entitles Linguini to ownership of the restaurant. So when Skinner's evil plot with the bad dessert fails, he resorts to trying to get the truth out of the boy. What makes this action so brilliantly placed is that Skinner has a lot of guile. He genuinely believes that he can uncover the truth about Linguini and the rat in no time. But instead, he finds out from a DNA result that Linguini is in fact Gusteau's son, and Skinner goes absolutely batshit crazy. The thought of losing his regime is terrifying, and he is in no way prepared for it. So desperate is Skinner to maintain control over the restaurant, in fact, that he quite literally chases a rat across all of Paris. Scooter riders, boat hopping, he does it all. All of this goes to show the extent of his desperation. At this point, I was wondering why Skinner didn't just abandon the restaurant and continue on with the frozen foods venture that he was already working on. I mean, we already know that he wanted money, right? He could get that from the brand. But what he really wanted, more than the money even, was to continue to stay in power as the head chef of a restaurant, even if that meant losing Michelin stars. I think that all of this weakens Skinner, but it gives us a bit of an insight into who he is, just a little bit cuckoo in the head.
Should I be concerned about this? About you?
Chef Skinner was ambitious, I'll give him that. Not only did he want the cha-ching that came from the restaurant, he also wanted to diversify his income portfolio. But I think that he held on to the head chef position, clinging desperately to the only position of power that he could because he didn't have any talents of his own. That was why he hadn't launched the burritos yet.
And it sells burritos! Millions and millions of burritos!
This is why Skinner needed to kidnap Remy and force him to make frozen foods in exchange for his life. After all, he was used to living this way. In all honesty, Skinner could have taken up sales. He could have taken up any other profession, but his foundation within himself was so weak that he didn't believe that he was capable of anything else. That's what I thought, at least. I'd love to find out whether you all agree with me or not. This is also a great ingredient for writing a tyrannical villain though, building their entire footing on something that is rightfully not theirs. That's quintessential oppression, and it allows a lot of room for animating this characteristic. And the reason this worked so well, given the setting of the film, is that the other characters were all striving to do things that they were good at. Nicole loved to cook, so did Remy. Horst became a security guy, and in the end, Linguini became a waiter because that was what he thought that he could best do. Even Anton Ego, the very personification of the Grim Reaper, was a food critic because of how much he loved food. Skinner was the only guy who loved money but chose to be a chef. This choice represents shallowness within. It adds depth to his personality. It allows us to understand who he really is, and that's what makes him such a great villain. But it goes even deeper than that. The message of the film, Anyone Can Cook, was, the way I saw it, a metaphor. It meant that anyone, no matter where they came from, could achieve whatever they were passionate about. But Gusteau, the person who talked about this, also repeatedly warned against stealing. And all that Skinner did was steal, making Skinner's every choice and every action incompatible with the message of the film enunciated his tyrannical villainy. So, Skinner's demise was always inevitable. But the way that it happened, oh boy. Chef Skinner spent decades in squalor, from the corruption that came with theft, but the fact that he met his demise from vermin was priceless. not only did a rat come in and teach a garbage boy how to cook, it was also this little squealer who stole the deed to the restaurant and made a run for it. And then it was this same rat, along with an army of others, that made the ratatouille that Anton Ego loved. And then they tied him up and threw him in the pantry. Gusteau's restaurant got shut down after all, but Ego invested in the next big thing in Paris, a restaurant where the tiny chef could cook. Given the fact that Remy was preoccupied, I don't think anyone would have helped Skinner set up his frozen foods line, so I don't think he would have gone ahead and done that. I wonder what Skinner is doing now. Given his height, I don't think he would have made it into the army, although a general would be a fitting position for someone who likes to maintain authority. Speaking of which, there's a theory about where that bit of his character design came from. Skinner had large, observant eyes. He also had full lips and potbelly that indicated his lust for power. His sharp mustache pointed towards his sharp mind and exacting nature. But his height? That was a nod to Napoleon Bonaparte, a military Frenchman who was erroneously believed to be a tad short. And besides the scientist, Skinner's name also points toward his ruthless nature, and well, his disregard for food.
And you're thin for someone who likes food.
Thin? Skinny? Skinner? Get it? Yeah, I'm probably overanalyzing it. Regardless, Chef Skinner was a tyrannical villain that was brilliantly crafted. Every aspect of his personality was etched into place with deliberation and care, and that's what made him so perfect. The fact that someone as sly as Skinner could have met his defeat the way that he did almost makes me feel a little sorry for him, but we didn't really see any grounds for redemption. Still, there's been some talk about this, so let's go over that. Throughout the movie, we watched Chef Skinner belittle and insult a boy who he thought was a threat to him. He was always too absorbed in his own interests to pay any real heed to what was happening around him and had a knack for sniffing out threats to his position from a mile away. Not only did he fail to preserve the legacy of his age-old friend, he also tried to kidnap and torture a rat to do his bidding. While he didn't outright kill anyone, Skinner was a thief through and through. He was wily, deceptive, and self-centered. He wasn't a smart business person. He was tarnishing the name of a genius. When Linguini showed up and cooked a brilliant soup, Skinner could have welcomed the food critics' free marketing with open arms. Rather, he lashed out at Linguini and continued to try to undermine him. For all his display of cleverness, that decision was pretty dumb. And even when he could have moved on, he tried to, and succeeded in, having Gusteau's restaurant shut down. He disposed of the place when he realized that he no longer had any use for it. This resentfulness is what makes him irredeemable. In conclusion, Skinner taught us a great deal, not only about what drives and motivates a tyrannical villain, but also what happens when you refuse to find out what drives you and instead capitalize on other people's work. What do you guys think Chef Skinner's true talent was? I mean, it wasn't business, cooking, and leadership. Is there something that he was good at that I missed out on? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, please remember to like and share this video with your friends, especially those that have a bad boss at work. See you all in the next video.